So this is our second new anatomy class. This is the last lecture, and then I think you have your quiz on May 13th. Okay. 20 ba or 30? May 20. So we'll have two topics today: the cranium and the brain. So first we'll talk about the cranium. So the cranium is defined as the skeleton of the head. So it is an amalgamation of functional components united to form a single skeletal formation. So the cranium is composed of multiple bones that are brought together. And there are two functional components. One is called the neurocranium, and the other is called the viscerocranium. The neurocranium is the container of the brain and the internal ears, while the viscerocranium provides the paired orbits, the nasal cavities, and the teeth-bearing plates of the oral cavity. So the teeth-bearing plates are called the alveolar processes. So this is a skull side view. This is an illustration from Moore, from our book. So the neurocranium is separated from the viscerocranium. So again, the neurocranium contains the brain and the internal ears, the inner ears, while the viscerocranium provides the orbits, the nasal cavity, and the alveolar processes that contain the teeth. So this is a front view of the skull. So again, the neurocranium is here superiorly, and the viscerocranium is inferior. We have the two orbits, the paired orbits. We have the nasal cavity, and then we have the alveolar processes of the maxilla and the mandible. And you can see that the neurocranium is an amalgamation of different bones. So for example, this bone is the frontal bone, and it is fused with the parietal bone here. And then inferior to the parietal bone, we have the temporal bone, and we have the sphenoid bone. Okay. Posterior to the parietal bone, we have the occipital bone. Okay. So the cranium is composed of multiple bones which are fused together. So there is some mobility between cranial bones during birth. So when the baby is born, the sutures are not yet fused, so the bones can move a little bit, so that allows the baby to fit while being delivered in the birth canal. Okay. But in adults, the cranial bones become fixed together by essentially immovable joints. And these joints are called sutures. So in the adult, it is only the mandible that is able to move independently. So other cranial bones become fused together. Okay, so again, a side view of the cranium. And we see here the different sutures. So in between the frontal bone and the parietal bone, we have the coronal suture. This is a side view, and this is a top view of the coronal suture. So here you are seeing the cranium from above. We're looking at the patient's head from above. So that's the coronal suture. That's also how you name the coronal cuts. No? When you do your MRI, you have cuts of the brain in this direction. Those are called coronal sections, no? Because they are parallel to the coronal suture. And then in the midline, you have this superior sagittal suture. Separating the left and the right parietal bones. And then here posteriorly you have the lambdoid suture. So this is the lambdoid suture. Separating the parietal from the occipital bones. So these sutures in the adult become fused and the joints are now removable. Okay. And then things to remember, this may come out in your quiz, no? The junction between the coronal suture and the superior sagittal suture, the sagittal suture is called the bregma. The junction between the coronal and the sagittal suture is the bregma, while the junction between the lambdoid suture and the sagittal suture is called the lambda. So as a side view, this is the bregma here, and this is the lambda here. Then you can also see in the side view the mandible. This is the only bone of the cranium that is mobile in the adult. So there is a joint here that allows the mandible to move up and down to allow us to chew. So there are abundant fissures and foramina that facilitate communication and passage of neurovascular structures between functional components. So there are many foramina or holes in the cranium to allow neurovascular structures, meaning nerves and blood vessels, to pass from the brain going out, or from the body going into the brain. So nerves and blood vessels. And the bony substance of the cranium is unequally distributed. There are relatively thin flat bones that provide the necessary strength to maintain cavities and protect contents, like your frontal bone. They are relatively thin, but mostly curved. And there are bones and processes of the neurocranium that provide proximal attachment for the strong muscles of mastication that attach distally to the mandible. So if you feel your cheek area, you have the zygomatic arch. So there are muscles that attach to that arch and then go down to the mandible to allow us to chew. Okay, so examples of the different cranial fissures and foramina. So here we have fissures, we have foramina where the cranial nerve 1 will go in from the nose going into the brain. So there are foramina here, and then we have the optic canal where cranial nerve 2 exits the brain and goes into the eyes. So that's the optic canal. And then we have the superior orbital fissure where the nerves 3, 4, and 6 exit the skull to go into the eye. And then foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, cranial nerve 5 will exit the brain through these foramina, and so on and so forth. So different foramina allowing nerve spinal cord. Okay, so that's a view of the skull looking from the top. And we can also reverse the skull, and we see the different foramina. So again, the foramen magnum and the different foramina labeled here. Okay, so this is again an illustration from Moore. And this is a tabulation telling us the contents of the different foramina. So again, important to remember the cribriform foramina allow the absence of olfactory cells in the olfactory epithelium in their nose to enter the brain. So they form the olfactory nerves. So cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. So cranial nerve 1 utilizes the cribriform foramina in the cribriform plane. It's found in the anterior cranial fossa. And then in the middle cranial fossa, again, the optic canals transmit the optic nerves, cranial nerve 2. And then the superior orbital fissure in the orbit will transmit cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, as well as the ophthalmic division of cranial nerve 5. So it's 3, 4, 6, and ophthalmic nerve that passes through the superior orbital fissure. Foramen rotundum is the maxillary division of cranial nerve 5, while foramen ovale transmits the mandibular division of cranial nerve 5. So cranial nerve 5 will go through superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum, and foramen ovale. And then another foramen is foramen spinosum. It transmits the middle meningeal artery, which is the blood supply of the dura mater of the brain. And then other foramina of note, the foramen magnum, again, this will allow the medulla to go out and become the spinal cord. It transmits the vertebral arteries, and then cranial nerve 11 goes out through the foramen magnum. The jugular foramen transmits cranial nerve 9, 10, and 11, while the hypoglossal canal transmits cranial nerve 12. So the different cranial nerves have different foramina where they exit. Okay. So again, this is in your book, so in Moore. So the high traction forces generated across the nasal cavity and the orbits, sandwiched between muscle attachments, are resisted by thickened portions of the bones, forming strong pillars or buttresses. So where there are strong forces, the bone thickens to form what is called a pillar or buttress. So the mostly superficial surface of the cranium provides both visible and palpable landmarks, which we neurosurgeons use in order to locate tumors, for example, in the brain. So the different buttresses, so there is frontal sagittal buttress, the bone thickens a little bit here. There is a frontal nasal buttress, zygomatic arch, and lateral orbit buttress. Then we have occipital buttresses. So the bone thickens a little bit in order to resist the forces of the muscles with the facial muscles. And we have landmarks. So I mentioned some of these. So again, the bregma is where the sagittal and the coronal sutures meet. The lambda is where the lambdoid and the sagittal sutures then we have the inion. If you feel at the back of your head, you have a protuberance there. That's called the inion, or the external occipital protuberance. And then the vertex is the topmost portion of the head, of the cranium. The glabella is the area right between the eyes. And then inferior, you have the nasion, where the nasal bones meet. So those are palpable landmarks. And then we have the area, where the corona and the temporal sutures meet. And then we have the asterion, where the lambdoid and the temporal sutures meet. So asterion and asterion. Okay, so those are craniometric points which will be useful if you ever decide to go into neurosurgery as your specialty later on. Okay, so now we go to the internal features of the cranial base. So the cranial features, the internal features of the cranial base reflect the major formations of the brain that rest on it. Bony ridges radiate from the centrally located sella turcica and divide the cranial base into 3 cranial fossae. So the frontal lobes of the brain lie in the anterior cranial fossa. The temporal lobes lie in the middle cranial fossa, while the hindbrain occupies the posterior cranial fossa, with the medulla continuing through the foramen magnum, where it is continuous with the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the sella turcica. This one. That's where the pituitary gland is. The sella turcica is like the depression in the middle of the base of the skull. And radiating from the sella turcica, we have this ridges. One ridge here and another ridge here. Okay, so these ridges will divide the cranial base into 3 fossae. So the anterior cranial fossa is colored green, and it supports the frontal lobe. The middle fossa is mostly colored red, and it supports the temporal lobe, while the posterior cranial fossa supports the cerebellum and the pons and the medulla. So anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. And again, we have the different foramina in the respective cranial fossae. Okay? So that's a view from the top, and this is an oblique view. So again, showing the sella turcica, and then the ridges that divide the cranial base into the anterior, the middle, and the posterior cranial fossae. Okay, so we're done with the external and internal features of the cranium. Now let's go to the skin covering. So the skin covering the cranium is called the scalp. The scalp consists of skin and subcutaneous tissue that covers the neurocranium from the superior nuchal lines on the occipital bone to the supraorbital margins of the frontal bone. Okay, so the inion is in line with the superior nuchal line. So that's the start of the scalp, and then the scalp goes forward up to the supraorbital margins of the frontal bone, so up to our eyebrows. That's our scalp. That's the skin covering the cranium, and it has 5 layers which are conveniently spelled out as scalp, not S-C-A-L-P. So if you have a scalpel and you incise the scalp, you go through these layers. So first the skin, and then the connective tissue underneath the skin, and then there's an aponeurosis, loose areolar tissue, and then you reach the pericranium. So again, it spells out S-C-A-L-P. So easy to memorize. Layers of the scalp. So it should show skin, connective tissue, aponeurosis, and then loose connective tissue and pericranium. So that's the scalp. Okay, so that ends our first topic. We're up to 12. I can schedule something 12. Anyway, we're now into our last topic. Our last topic will be the cranial meninges and the brain. So the meninges are the coverings of the brain. So there are 3 intracranial layers. So they're beneath the cranium or beneath the bone. So we have first the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. So 3 layers. Dura, arachnoid, and pia. So that's from external to internal. Okay. So if this is the bone, so that's the bone. There. Underneath it, we have the meninges. So the meninges are enlarged. This rectangular section is enlarged. So we can see dura mater. So the dura mater is in blue, and then arachnoid mater with trabeculae, and then we have the pia mater just on top of the brain. So again, dura, arachnoid, and then pia, from external going internal. So the dura has an outer lamina that is continuous with the periosteum on the external surface of the cranium, and it is intimately applied to the internal surface of the cranial cavity. So there's an outer lamina that is very close to the bone, and then there is an inner lamina called the meningeal lamina, which is a supporting layer that more closely reflects the contours of the brain. So if you take your scalpel and incise the dura, you can see that the dura also has 2 layers, the outer layer and the meningeal or inner layer. The inner layer separates from the outer layer in certain locations to form dural folds or dural reflections. These penetrate the large fissures within parts of the brain, partially subdividing the cranial cavity into smaller compartments that prevent inertial brain movement. So for example, between our left and right brains, there is a fold of dura that separates them. So if our head is shaken left and right, that fold of dura will help to stabilize the brain. So in separating from the periosteal lamina, intralaminar spaces are created that accommodate the dural venous sinuses. So in between the two layers of dura, the space that is created becomes the dural venous sinus. This receives the venous drainage of the brain, and the venous sinuses mainly drain in turn to the internal jugular vein. Okay, so this is a close-up again of the dura mater. So this is the periosseous layer, which is very close to the bone, and the meningeal layer creates a space, and the space becomes the venous sinus. Specifically, this is the superior sagittal sinus, just underneath our sagittal suture. So we have our sagittal suture in the midline. The dura underneath it separates to form the superior sagittal sinus. And then the meningeal dura also forms this fold, which is called the falx cerebri. The falx cerebri separates the left cerebral hemisphere from the right. Okay, so that's the falx cerebri, and its origin is here. It has the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, so if you look at a side view of the right cerebral hemisphere, so here our patient is facing to your left side. The left cerebral hemisphere has been removed, and we are seeing the right cerebral hemisphere from the side. This is the midline of the right cerebral hemisphere. So we see the superior sagittal sinus. So the veins of the brain will drain into the superior sagittal sinus, and blood will flow down here into the confluence of sinuses. So the confluence is in the area of the ilium. So again, the external occipital protuberance, underneath it is the confluence of sinuses. And from the confluence, the blood will go to the transverse sinuses, into the sigmoid sinus, and into the internal jugular vein. So that is the route of venous blood. From the internal jugular vein, it goes to the superior vena cava of the heart, and then it is pumped to the lungs for oxygenation, and then back into the arterial circulation. Okay. So again, the dural venous sinuses are formed by the separation between the periosseal and the meningeal dura. Going down from the dura, we have the arachnoid and pia. Collectively, we call them the leptomenics. So the arachnoid and pia are continuous parietal and visceral layers of the leptomenics that surrounds the CSF-filled subarachnoid space. The arachnoid and pia are connected by fine trabeculae that traverse the subarachnoid space, and the subarachnoid space of the cranial cavity is continuous without vertebral anatomy. So again, the same illustration. So underneath the dura, so this is dura, underneath it we have the arachnoid. That's the arachnoid layer. And then we have arachnoid trabecula, and then we have pia mater on the brain. So arachnoid and pia. And between these two layers, we have the CSF. So the CSF is here, and it will apply pressure on the arachnoid matter, so it is close to the dura. So the subarachnoid space in the brain is continuous to the subarachnoid space in the spinal cord. So the arachnoid is normally applied to the internal surface of the dura by CSF pressure. So CSF is exerting pressure on the arachnoid, so it is close to the dura. You can measure the CSF pressure by inserting a needle in the lumbar subarachnoid space, and then you attach a manometer, and CSF will rise up so that you can measure the pressure. And the pressure is about 7 to 14 millimeters mercury. So there is a pressure applied by CSF. The PIA intimately invests the neural tissue and its surface vasculature, coursing deeply along vessels as they enter or exit the nervous system. So the PIA is very close to the brain and very close to the blood vessels supplying the brain. Okay, so again, that's arachnoid matter, then arachnoid trabecula with CSF there, and then PIA matter right on the brain. Okay. Neurovasculature of the meninges. So the cranial meninges receive blood primarily from the middle meningeal arteries, which are branches of the maxillary arteries. So again, if you remember from the slide on the foramina, the foramen spinosum is where the middle meningeal artery enters the cranial cavity to supply the meninges. And then the dura receives sensory innervation from meningeal branches of all three divisions of the trigeminal nerve and fibers from the C2 or the second cervical spinal ganglia. So if you have anything which irritates the dura, you can have a headache because of the branches of the trigeminal nerve supplying the dura. If you have a toothache, you can also have a headache because they are all supplied by the trigeminal nerve. And sometimes you can have neck pain because of the fibers from the cervical spinal ganglia, second cervical spinal ganglia. Okay, so we're done with the cranium, we're done with the corporates of the dura, arachnoid, PIA. Now we go to the brain. So the brain has two hemispheres, so left and the right. The two hemispheres are separated by the fat cerebri, and these are the dominant features of the human brain. So again, the fat cerebri is the fold of dura that formed by the meningeal dura, separating the left and the right hemisphere. Each cerebral hemisphere is divided for descriptive purposes into 4 lobes related to the overlying bones of the same name. So the lobes are named as they relate to the bones. So here, this is a top view. You are looking at the patient from the top. The patient's nose is pointing superiorly. In this view, the nose is pointing that way. This is the left cerebral hemisphere. This is the right cerebral hemisphere. And you have this longitudinal cerebral fissure, which contains the falx cerebri, separating the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. And colored green is the frontal lobe. So this is the left frontal lobe in green, and this is the right frontal lobe also in green. So it is named frontal lobe because it is underneath the frontal bone. But if you superimpose the skull, the coronal suture is somewhere here. Here, that's the coronal suture. So there's a part of the frontal lobe that is posterior to the coronal suture. So meaning part of the frontal lobe is underneath the parietal bone already. So that's frontal lobe, and then in between the frontal and parietal lobes, we have a central sulcus of Rolando. So this is the central sulcus separating the two. And in orange, we have the parietal lobes. So this is a side view. This patient is facing to your right side. We are seeing the right cerebral hemisphere. And here we see the frontal lobe again in green. There is a central sulcus of Rolando here, separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is colored orange. And then underneath the occipital bone, we have the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is in violet in this illustration. Okay. Then we have another lobe here in yellow underneath the temporal bone called the temporal lobe. So it is separated from the parietal lobe by a lateral sulcus, also called the Sylvian fissure. So it separates the parietal and the temporal lobes. Okay, so those are the periphery. If you go inside, into the deeper parts of the brain, we have the diencephalon, which forms the central core of the brain. And then inferior to the diencephalon, we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, which are the three components of the brain stem. And then below the medulla, we have the spinal cord. And then the cerebellum is the subtentorial brain mass occupying the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, so here we have a view of the left cerebral hemisphere from the side. So again, the patient is facing to your right. The right cerebral hemisphere has been removed, and we are seeing the medial surface of the left cerebral hemisphere. And inside we can see the diencephalon here, the brainstem here, and the cerebellum. So if we zoom in, here we have the diencephalon colored blue, the brainstem colored yellow, and the cerebellum colored red. So again, the cerebellum and the brainstem are found in the posterior cranial fossa. Okay. So the brainstem is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So the brain also has ventricles. So these are spaces which contain CSF. Each cerebral hemisphere includes a lateral ventricle in its core. So the left cerebral hemisphere has a lateral ventricle inside it. The right cerebral hemisphere also has a lateral ventricle inside it. Otherwise, the ventricular system is an unpaired median formation that communicates within with the subarachnoid space surrounding the brain and spinal cord. So again, the CSF space of the brain is connected to the CSF space of the spinal cord. So if you measure the pressure at the spinal cord level, you are also measuring the pressure in the brain, the CSF pressure in the brain. Choroid plexus secretes CSF into the ventricles, which flows out of them into the subarachnoid space. And CSF is absorbed into the venous system, normally at the same rate at which it is produced by arachnoid granulations related to the superior sagittal sinus. So we produce CSF at a rate of about 500 cc every day, 500 ml. So that is also the rate at which the arachnoid granulations will reabsorb the CSF. And it will bring the CSF back to the superior sagittal sinus, where it will join the venous circulation. Okay, so this is again from Moore. So we have the lateral ventricle here inside the left cerebral hemisphere. The lateral ventricle has choroid plexus, which will produce CSF. So CSF is produced from the choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles here. CSF flows down into this interventricular foramen of Monro. So there is an interventricular foramen of Monro which transmits the CSF into the third ventricle. The third ventricle is surrounded by the diencephalon. So there, CSF will flow from the third ventricle into this small canal. This small canal is called the aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay. And CSF is transmitted into the fourth ventricle here. Okay. So from the fourth ventricle, there are lateral foramina of Luschka, which will transmit the CSF to the cerebral subarachnoid space. So lateral foramen of Luschka, and then there is another median foramen of Magendie here. Okay, so CSF goes into the cerebral subarachnoid space, and then CSF will go up to be reabsorbed by the arachnoid granulations here, and then CSF is sent back to the superior sagittal sinus to rejoin the venous circulation. Then it goes again to the heart pumps blood again to the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus will form new CSF and the cycle continues. Okay? So what happens if, for example, there is a brain tumor here obstructing the aqueduct of Sylvius? CSF cannot go down. So CSF being produced at 500 cc every day, CSF will accumulate in the lateral and in the third ventricles, producing hydrocephalus. And it can increase the intracranial pressure so high that blood cannot flow into the brain. The patient can become comatose, and it can be a fatal situation if there is increased pressure from hydrocephalus. Okay? So that is the flow of CSF. That's a common cause of hydrocephalus obstruction in the aqueduct. There are also some babies who were born with aqueductal stenosis. So they have congenital hydrocephalus. There are also some patients who have tuberculous meningitis. And fibrosis can obstruct the arachnoid granulations. And CSF is not reabsorbed. So what happens? All the ventricles will dilate. So the lateral, the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle will also dilate, causing hydrocephalus. So how do we treat that? We can put a tube in the lateral ventricle, drain the hydrocephalus through the tube, and then send the excess CSF into the peritoneal cavity so that it is drained there. So that is a way to correct the hydrocephalus. Okay, arterial supply. Where does the brain get its nutrients and its oxygen? So a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients is essential for brain function. So our nerve cells or neurons are continually sending signals. When we want our muscles to move, or we are sensing things from the environment. So our neurons are always needing oxygen for ATP and needing glucose in order for them to function. The brain receives a dual blood supply from the cerebral branches of the bilaterally paired internal carotid arteries as well as the paired vertebral arteries. So the internal carotid arteries are going up our neck and the cranial cavity and supply the brain. The vertebral arteries are also going up the neck to supply the brain. There is an anastomosis in the base of the brain called the cerebral arterial circle, where all the four arteries form a circle, an anastomotic circle. So this is called the cerebral arterial circle of Willis. And anastomosis also occurs between the branches of the cerebral arteries on the surface of the brain. Okay, so this is a phantom view of the neck and the cranium. So we can see here this artery. This is the right internal cerebral artery. So it also has a left internal cerebral artery as its pair. So they are the first pair of arteries supplying the brain. And we have here another artery. So this time, this artery goes through the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae. If you remember, the transverse processes have a foramen. That foramen is for this right vertebral artery to pass through, and there's also a left vertebral artery. So the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries will supply the nutrients and oxygen to the brain. And then here on the next illustration, we are looking at the base of the brain. We are looking at the patient lying supine with the feet toward you, and we see this arterial circle. This arterial circle is formed by the anastomosis of the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries. Okay. So in adults, if one of the four arteries is blocked, the remaining three are not usually capable of providing adequate collateral circulation. So unfortunately, even with the arterial circle, if there is a major block in an artery, the collateral circulation is not enough and the patient will have a stroke. So consequently, impaired cerebral blood flow and an ischemic stroke will result. Okay, so this is a base of the brain. No? So this is the right internal carotid artery. This is the right vertebral artery. This is the left vertebral, and this is the left internal carotid. So the internal carotid artery has a branch called the anterior cerebral. So it anastomoses with the anterior cerebral of the other side to form the anterior portion of the circle of Willis. The internal carotid artery has a branch called the posterior communicating artery, which will anastomose with the posterior cerebral arteries here, forming the posterior part of the circle. And the posterior cerebral arteries come from a basilar trunk, which is formed by the two vertebral arteries. Okay? So if there is an obstruction, a mild obstruction here, blood cannot flow distally here to the middle cerebral artery, for example. So what happens? Blood from the left side can go through the arterial circle and supply the block on the right. So that is the significance of the circle of Willis. However, if the block is large, the blood supply might not be adequate, and the person can still have a stroke. Okay? So in the violet, we see here the middle cerebral artery, and it has branches supplying the lateral surface of the brain. So all of these branches are violet. So that means they are branches of the middle cerebral artery, which is a terminal branch of the internal carotid. Okay? So the middle cerebral artery supplies the lateral portions of the cerebral hemisphere. The anterior cerebral arteries are colored green, and they supply the medial surface of the hemispheres. So here, the medial frontal lobe, they supply the medial parietal lobe. That's the blood supply of the anterior cerebral arteries. The posterior cerebral arteries are colored orange, and they supply the medial occipital lobe. Okay? So what is the clinical significance? If there is a block in the posterior cerebral artery, you will have a stroke in the occipital lobe, you will have visual deficit. If there is a block in the anterior cerebral artery on the left, for example, so you will have a stroke in the left frontal lobe, and you will have right leg weakness. Okay? Venous drainage. The venous drainage occurs via the dural venous sinuses and the internal jugular veins. So what I pointed out earlier, from the superior sagittal, it goes to the confluence, then transverse sigmoid sinus, internal jugular vein, superior vena cava, and back to the heart. Okay, so that's our two topics. So the lectures are just introductions. This is a big topic. So please read your books. And the questions for the exam will be from Moore. So how many items did Dr. Delmar assign for this? 100 items. 100 items. So please read the books. So you still have 3 hours. Begin. So thank you very much for the attention. Any questions? So please utilize the time to read on our topics. Thank you.
God.